Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Fiddle and Fire by Ariella, Talix, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Fire! The dreaded word echoed through the streets of San Francisco that foggy morning. It was pandemonium as people ran both toward and away from the blaze, and bells clanged in the closest fire companies. Isaac, Walter, and the other volunteer firemen dropped everything and grabbed the hand-drawn fire truck. As quickly as possible, they dragged the heavily loaded cart full of water and equipment up and down the steep city streets. Other men grabbed a ladder loaded with water-filled buckets hanging from it by hooks. It took 4 men to carry it the way pallbearers hoist and move a coffin. The Aylesbury Fire Company's 2 Dalmatians, Ember and Cinder, ran ahead of the firemen. The dogs barked a warning, letting people know that firefighters were on the way and the street needed to be cleared. Firefighters also shouted at pedestrians to move and hoped fervently they could make it in time to douse the flames before another major fire destroyed the city. That kind of catastrophic destruction happened all too frequently in San Francisco. Thank heaven this one wasn't too big, Walter sighed as they trudged back up the hill to their department. Yes, no injuries either, Isaac agreed. Not like the one that broke out last May when so many people were hurt and it burned down that whole block. A terrible thing. He shook his head sadly, remembering the event. As they neared the front of their building, he grasped Walter's arm to halt him for a moment. Never get tired of looking at this, Walter. You outdid yourself with the design. We're the envy of all the firemen in the city with this place. Walter had worked back in Philadelphia as an architect, but the stifling job left him unfulfilled and ready to move on to something better out west. He'd quit his job after refusing to cut corners and design shoddy buildings, something that had been a problem for his employer, who was also his father. So Walter severed ties with the man who'd tried to control his every move. His father was strict and humorless, never showing any pride in his son's work or affection for him. His mother had been better, but she'd long since passed away. At least, Walter reasoned, they'd seen to his education, and Walter genuinely loved architecture. Restless and young, he had saved enough money to take off on an adventure to find something that would inspire him. A small inheritance from his grandfather also helped. Walter smiled graciously. Yes, well, I'm sure the competition between the fire companies will continue even if our building is superior. There are so many egos involved, and with most of the city acting as if we're almost celebrities, except you, of course. You're an actual celebrity, I suppose. Isaac snorted. Just because of my fiddling? Hardly. When we play, they're probably all coming to gawk at Adeline. Isaac performed with Adeline Hart Dawson Langley, a beautiful and exceptionally talented pianist. When she'd arrived in San Francisco, the ratio of men to women was roughly 10-1, and although the odds were gradually evening out, women were still very much in the minority. Firefighters stowed their gear carefully as Walter argued. You're selling yourself short. I see how the ladies look at you when you play, and some of the men, too. Isaac shrugged. He'd played the violin since he was a small boy. His parents had encouraged it, deciding he needed an activity that would help him use up some of his excess energy. Luckily for everyone, music fascinated him. Now that he was grown, there was nothing small about Isaac. He was a giant of a man at over 6 feet tall with muscles honed from years of heavy, back-breaking work. He and his partners had mined for gold before and during the San Francisco gold rush, made a substantial fortune for themselves, and then built the Discovery, a successful hotel and casino. Eventually, they formed a building company Walter and Isaac ran with Jasper and Royal, who, with their wife Adeline, were their best friends in the world. Isaac and Adeline also gave music lessons and recitals together at the National Theater. Isaac was not only a gifted and proficient musician, but he also handcrafted beautiful instruments. And because the demand for that in San Francisco was limited, he also crafted exquisite wooden furniture and finished carpentry. With all of the building going on in the city at that time, their company, Roja Wyas, was tremendously busy and sought after. Isaac was one of the busiest men in San Francisco, being a volunteer fireman, a carpenter, instrument maker, music teacher, and practicing musician. He wouldn't have it any other way, however, as his exuberant nature and boundless energy needed plenty of outlets. His parents had been right to channel his high spirits into music. Walter, on the other hand, was quite content to plan and design buildings and homes for the men of Rojalwayas to build, and when he wasn't helping put out fires or drawing up architectural plans, he had his nose in a book. Walter was well read on a staggering array of topics. He seemed sometimes like a walking library. He also had a golden tongue and loved to tell stories. Although only a few years older, Walter sometimes felt he needed to look after Isaac to make sure the younger man was getting enough food and rest, but he kept that to himself and did it unobtrusively. You know, the people who are moving into the new house we just built ought to be arriving in a few days, he pointed out to Isaac. Their friend, Doc Louis Montrachet, had distant acquaintances who planned to send their son to San Francisco from France and who needed to have a house built for him. It took a year for the necessary letters to go back and forth to seal the deal. Yes, I'm aware. I'm actually headed over there now because I still need to do some finish work in the dining room. It's the one room that's not completed. He looked down at his sooty clothes, soiled from the fire they'd just put out. He was sweaty and streaked with ash. I guess it doesn't matter what I look like if I'm going to go make a mess of myself over there anyway. I'm just going to go grab a quick bite and we'll see you later. Adeline and I have lessons scheduled this afternoon, so I'll need to hurry if I want to accomplish anything. He scampered off to the kitchen, hoping to find the chef in an amiable enough mood to offer him something in a rush. Walter decided he'd clean up and relax for a few minutes with a new book he'd just found about electricity. It sounded like magic to him, and he could certainly see the potential value of it. After that, he thought he'd make some headway on the new building plan he needed to draw up. Walter and Isaac had recently moved out of the Discovery, thus giving more space to the hotel for guests, and into their exquisite firehouse. This fire department was known as Aylesbury Fire Company because of the fancy top hats they sported during the formal dress parades that happened at various times throughout the year. Each firehouse had its own personality, and theirs was basically a fine gentleman's club. They had a highly trained chef who kept them fed with nothing but the freshest and finest foods, and they constantly stocked the best spirits and cigars they could get their hands on. Unlike the blue-collar firemen of the eastern states, who had a well-deserved reputation for violence, San Franciscan firemen were not only local heroes, but they were also considered gentlemen with fine taste. They may have felt competitive about getting to a fire before another company, but in the enlightened age of 1855, they didn't do anything about it other than brag. Ensconced in a comfortable chair by a sunny window, now that the morning fog had burnt off, Walter smiled fondly as he watched Isaac, his favorite person on earth, rush out of the building and off to take care of business. Catching Walter's smile, another fireman named Richard, who was also relaxing with a book, asked, "Have you known him long?" Ember and Cinder lay sprawled at his feet. Richard had trained the young dogs since they were puppies, and as much as they enjoyed the company of all the men, they were completely devoted to him. Walter answered with a smile. "Several years now. We met back east by accident, and we've been best friends ever since that moment." Walter got a faraway look on his face when he added, "Traveling across country together and then working side by side every day definitely forms a bond. And Isaac isn't just a good man, he's the best. He's also the most talented person I know." "How'd you meet him by accident?" Walter closed his book and laughed. He loved to tell this story. Actually, Walter loved to tell any story, but this one was one of his favorites. "I was driving my wagon down a Pittsburgh city street, and all of a sudden this enormous young blonde fellow flew out of the building, all wide-eyed. He flung himself into the back of my wagon, hunkered down out of sight, and begged me to get him out of there as fast as possible. I'd have been worried that he was trying to rob me or something, but his arms were full of what looked like a heavy as blazes pack of tools, and of all things, a violin case. He looked so sincere when he begged me." Walter deepened his voice in an imitation of Isaac. "Please, mister, I swear I'm no thief, but I need to get out of here." It was then that I spied another older fellow come barreling out behind him with a shotgun. The man seemed to be trying to run and load the gun at the same time, and then he tripped over his own clumsy feet. Not wanting to be shot by the careless fool, I coaxed my team into a speedier gait, but not so fast as to draw undue attention to ourselves, mind you, and figured I'd find out what all the fracas was about when we were out of range of that buffoon with the buckshot. We made our way as quickly as was prudent straight out of town. I finally let the horses have a rest in a nice shady area, a far piece out of the city, where they could get a drink and graze a while. Can't tell you how curious I was to find out whether or not I was harboring a criminal, but My gut instinct told me it was something else that made that big young man bolt that way. He had too honest of a face to be a thief or a killer, and he was barely a boyhood back then. Richard laughed then and observed, "Apparently you have a good eye for character. I don't see any evidence that he slit your throat or shot you." Isaac is the kind of man who's big and strong enough to tear someone limb from limb. He does have a temper that he normally keeps locked down, but when he's feeling emotional, he'd rather pound nails into wood or rip things up with that fiddle of his than do actual bodily harm to anyone. He pours more passion into his music than you could even imagine. Being a firefighter is perfect for him because he wants to save the world, but I always worry he'll hurt his hands and not be able to play anymore. Walter sighed. That would be such a loss. Walter fixed his gaze on the window and ruminated. So why was he running? Walter blinked. Oh, sorry, I got diverted there for a moment. Wool gathering about his music. Yes, well, he was running from a furious father, as it turns out. Richard smirked and nodded. Did he leave behind a bastard? Oh, no, nothing like that. He was an innocent victim of circumstance. The daughter of the man he was apprenticed to was apparently quite taken with Isaac and caused the whole thing. She actually hoisted her skirt, jumped onto Isaac's lap, and wrapped her arms around him right when she knew her father would see them. She hinted to Isaac on more than one occasion that she'd like to marry him, but Isaac had no interest in losing his apprenticeship or in marrying her. He thought she was pretty, but also a scheming little troublemaker, and obviously he was right. Walter chuckled and shook his head. Her antics and her flirting just got worse and worse until this time she plastered a kiss on his lips and tried to make it look like they were in a compromised position, so her father would force Isaac to marry her. Isaac heard her father coming, dumped her off his lap, grabbed his tools and violin, and skedaddled out of there like the devil himself was after him. He didn't want anything to do with either of them after that. Well, I'll be. Do you ever see her again? Nope. As soon as I realized he was serious, we just kept heading west. He said his apprenticeship was nearly finished anyway, and he was ready to move on. We hit it off famously from the very start, so I told him about my plans to keep traveling and meet up eventually with a wagon train in Missouri. That was fine with him, and the rest is history. Walter thought a moment and then added, Isaac is such a talented woodworker. I'm sure he had to have been better at it than his employer at that point. I wager that the man was trying to force him back to work by scaring him rather than trying to run him off. For all I know, he might have put his daughter up to it, was using her as bait to better his own business by keeping Isaac around permanently. He's certainly been an outstanding part of our building company. No one can beat his carpenter skills. What did Isaac's father say about him leaving his apprenticeship? He must have been disappointed. Walter looked sad then and got that faraway look again. Isaac was on his own. His parents perished in a house fire, and he ended up finding his own apprenticeship. He was not at home when the fire happened because he was off fiddling for some folks, and it was a dreadful shock for him to come back to, I can tell you that. He had no siblings, and his parents were older. I guess they were close. He was so shaken up about it, he could barely even stand to look at a campfire for the longest time. It was when we arrived in San Francisco that he faced his fears and began fighting fires. He says it's his way of making sure no other families suffer the way his did. That's quite a story, Richard exclaimed softly. He reached down and petted the dogs thoughtfully. Just goes to show how little we know about people we see every day. Just then, they heard a bell chime, signaling that their new meal was ready. Let's eat. I'm starved, Walter declared.